Reverend Magrey deVega is with us in Iowa at the Orders event in fall 2018. It's a different kind of Orders event. It's conversational, it's an immersion experience, and it's also one that's touched by deep respect for each other. Magrey, thanks for being here first.
It's my great privilege to be back here among dear friends and colleagues in Iowa.
You spent a number of years in Cherokee, sandwiched in between your ministry in Florida.
Right. Some of my best years of ministry are 8 years here in the Iowa Conference, serving in the Northwest District at St. Paul's United Methodist in Cherokee. Before that, I was 7 years serving as an associate pastor in Tampa at Hyde Park United Methodist. Then was put on loan to the Iowa Conference for 8 years, 2007 to 2015. Just a remarkable, beautiful, loving place to do ministry. Fell in love with the people of Cherokee and still miss them to this day. They're formative to who I am, taught me a lot about ministry, and in some ways prepared me for the longevity of my ministry, which now brings me back to Florida, back to Hyde Park United Methodist in Tampa, where since 2015 I've served as the senior pastor. The people of Iowa impressed me from the very beginning of being earnest, hard-working, decent, full of integrity, non-pretentious. You knew who they were unafraid to disclose their heart, and it's that kind of authenticity that enables a minister to really thrive and to remember the core of our pastoral calling, which is that people matter, all people matter, and to love people for who they are. The people of Cherokee taught me that. Frankly, it's a reminder that I needed, and I'll be forever grateful for them and for these beautiful colleagues of mine here in the Iowa Conference, many of whom are still dear friends of mine. They've made an impression on me for the long haul.
Talk about this point of view experience, how it got started in Florida.
Right. So I serve under a bishop, Ken Carter, who is a member of the Commission on a Way Forward, one of the co-moderators, and last year realized that regardless of what happens at the Special General Conference in St. Louis next February, local congregations would have to be able to have earnest conversations about controversial topics. This one in particular, LGBTQ inclusion. And it's not a muscle that many congregations are used to flexing, having healthy conversations about things that aren't divisive or polarized. Frankly, that's too easy to be polarized in the kind of culture we live in today. So he set about creating a design team who would create material to make it easier and more effective for congregations to have hard conversations based on 3 principles: empathy, context, and mission. And so the hope is that for folks who are experiencing POV, including these Iowa colleagues of mine, that they would walk away believing that the LGBTQ conversation is not some intellectual debate for which to score points, but to honor people's dignity and self-worth and to develop conversations of empathy, understanding, and healthy dialogue. So all of these elements throughout the day and in this curriculum are really geared toward helping people listen, like really listen to the perspective of another person. And at the very end, not to make another person agree with you, not for everyone to agree on the same thing, and certainly not to vote on anything, but to affirm how all of us are people of sacred worth.
One of the first charts you put on the screen today had a sort of above the line and below the line experience.
Right.
And if I understood right, you talked about how easy it is to live in the above the line. Right. And when you get down to the relational part, which is sort of below that dotted line, that's a much harder place to be.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That concept comes from a book called A Heart of Peace by the Arbinger Institute. It was very formative for members of the Commission on a Way Forward. When you're engaging a polarizing topic, whether it be LGBTQ conversation or anything, it is far too easy to engage a person simply based on what you see and hear of that person's perspective, their behavior, their words. In order to engage a person with empathy, you have to be willing to go, in this model, below the dotted line, below the surface, to get into the heart of that person's perspective. And when you do that, you have a choice. You can either have a heart of peace or a heart of war. A heart of war sees that person simply as an object to debate. A heart of peace sees that person as a person of value. A heart of war sees this as a debate where you score points or lose points. A heart of peace emphasizes relationship and valuing each other. And so that's a pretty critical foundation, not only for the commission's work, but for any congregation, any relationship where you want to have a heart of peace with someone.
You invited us today to be in some small groups, which is in a way unusual for orders events where most often it's a lecture kind of presentation, maybe some Q&A at the end, but mostly one way. Today was anything but one way. There were 4 different kinds of groupings within the larger 18 or 20 circles that were present today. And there were 4 frames of conversation. Talk a little bit about those 4 subdivisions or 4 frames.
The exercise is called an empathy map. It came to us from this design thinking group that worked with us to design the material called We Are Curio. And really it is a targeted, efficient exercise to get people to think through the perspective of another person with whom they might disagree, according to 4 different frames. 4 different representations along the ideological spectrum of the conversation. For some of the groups that exercised this today, it was a frame with whom they disagree, and it prompted them, in some ways forced them, to go below the dotted line in their understanding of that person's perspective. And if you look at those frames, all 4 of those frames, the reminder here is that all 4 of those frames across the spectrum are all represented in our congregations. All 4 of these people are in our pews, they're in our communities, they're even serving as colleagues among us. And it's important to not peg those people as objects by their opinions, but to really see them as people. So this empathy map exercise is pretty critical to the entire flow of the day. Much of the material is homegrown out of the Florida conference, and so all of the videos that featured people speaking are colleagues, clergy and lay people serving in the Florida conference. And those 4 folks who represented each of those 4 frames self-identified with those frames and were willing to speak to the camera to talk about why they are that particular frame, but more importantly, what was at stake for them personally, what their pains and their gains were. It's a pretty critical part of the material, because if you didn't have actual people speaking to those frames, then the empathy map exercise could come and go simply based on caricaturizations that the people in the room make. And so we wanted to create guardrails, if you will, to make sure that anything that was spoken in this exercise about people was counterbalanced by actual people speaking from their own perspective and in their own words.
At the end of the day, what do you hope people go away with?
I think the phrase that comes to mind is a spirit of love. The hope here is, again, that we're not going to change people's minds, that we're not going to come to common agreement about all of the aspects of this conversation. But if we can create and affirm together a spirit of love for each other, for the people that we serve, and for the mission that God has called us to, which is the way we end our experience today, focusing on the mission to which we're all called, in a spirit of love, that would be very helpful. And my hope is that future gatherings of the clergy of the Iowa Conference will be marked by that spirit of love, because it is far too easy, and tempting, and addictive to fall into hurt, polarization, condescension, demonizing. That's easy to do because the culture wants us to operate that way. A spirit of love is hard work, but it is the calling for all of us.